Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this plenary session of the CU conference. In this morning session, we will hear about SDG 4, education. After the plenary, we will continue with panel sessions on SDG 3, SDG, and SDG 11. The links, and also SDG 14 and SDG 15 and SDG 7. The links for those sessions will appear soon in front of you in the chat. Now I'll introduce you our chairperson for this session. He holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of São Paulo. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Université de Paris 7 and the Universitat de Barcelona. He was a visiting professor at Université de Lille. He has a research productivity grant from CNPq. He's a full professor at the philosophy department here at UFPR, and is a faculty member of the graduate programs on philosophy and on education. His research encompasses the themes of power relations, asymmetries, and human rights, and also democracy in crisis, biopolitical violence, and neoliberal management of people's lives. He is the director of the UFPR International Office. I would like you all to welcome Professor André Duarte.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning to you all. Good afternoon, people outside Brazil. It's a pleasure to be here and to present Omar Hernández, who accepted our invitation to participate in this plenary on SDG 4. Omar Hernández, he's a public information officer at the United Nations Academic Impact Initiative and focal point on sustainable development goals and institutions of higher education. Previously, he served as volunteer and conference management specialist at the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat and as a consultant for the Education for Justice Initiative of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Moreover, Omar volunteered with the Liaison Office of the United Nations Agency for Palestine Refugees and also with the World Federation of United Nations Associations, as well as for the United Nations Association of Venezuela. Furthermore, for almost 5 years, Omar worked in his home country, Venezuela, as an international news analyst and editor in a local newspaper, including various assignments as a temporary correspondent at the United Nations in Geneva, covering the Human Rights Council and the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In addition to this, and also in Venezuela, Omar taught for a decade and a half at the Andrés Bello Catholic University. He taught courses on international journalism, international public law, and international human rights law, while providing training to civil society on UN human rights mechanisms and being an advisor of student delegations in model UN conferences. At the same time, he was an active member of the Academic Council on the United Nations system, conducting research on a wide range of issues on multilateral diplomacy and international affairs. Omar has a master's degree in cooperation for development with specialization in international humanitarian aid, a diploma of advanced studies in freedom of expression and right to information, and a bachelor's degree in international studies. So thank you so much for being here, Omar. It's a pleasure to have you here and for us to hear what you have to say and for us to debate your presentation. Please, the stage is yours.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation that the university has given us and myself. And it's always an honor for me as a member of the United Nations Academic Impact to actually be able to have these speaking engagements with our own member institutions, particularly in such a challenging time And it is indeed quite a privilege to be able to speak to the audience and speak about these issues related to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, but also to highlight the role of institutions of higher education to achieve these goals. For those of you who are not familiar with the UN Academic Impact, we are an initiative that is housed in the Outreach Division of the Department of Global Communications in the United Nations Secretariat here in New York. We are basically, our mandate is to align universities and colleges around the world with the goals, principles, ideals that are enshrined in the United Nations Charter, including, of course, those of the promotion and protection of human rights and the fostering of economic and social cooperation among nations. And this is of particular relevance when we frame this in the decade of action for the SDGs that is being promoted by the United Nations since earlier 2020, just before the pandemic hit. And when we think about universities and colleges, and as mentioned during the introduction, I used to teach in a university setting for more than 15 years. So I'm now in the other side of the equation, but I fully understand that the potential of universities when it comes to teaching, research, community engagement, extension programs, and all the dynamism of the students, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, all those things are fundamental in actually achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And while 2030 might seem like a very distant future, it's actually just around the corner. And we cannot forget the fact that this ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has seriously impacted the advancements that were achieved during the past few years, particularly in the developing world. So we have many setbacks. There's a need to build back better. And in this new normal, whatever we consider a new normal is, it cannot be the same normal that we used to have before the pandemic. I think this global health, economic, social crisis that we are all facing around the world is also an opportunity to rethink. It's an opportunity to redesign. It's an opportunity to innovate. It's an opportunity to consider the things that were not working at all, and it's an opportunity to have a more inclusive world, a more sustainable world, and a world that fits us all, as the motto of the SDGs, and it has been proclaimed over and over and over again by the United Nations and different member states, is that we cannot leave anyone behind. So this is an opportunity now that we think in how to recover the economy, how to recover the dynamics of international trade and commerce. We have to really think in the most important focus of the SDG, which in the end is the human being. Now, when it comes to universities, we know, of course, the various academic programs and the research centers and the outcomes and publications coming out from universities and colleges way before the pandemic and even way before the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted. But I would like to say that we need, and by we I mean the United Nations and the international community, we need the expertise coming from universities. We need this knowledge that is being promoted, is being expanded by the wonderful work of lecturers, professors, assistant professors, researchers, scientists, and even the work that is being done by university staff, and of course, the ideas that are promoted by students themselves. We think that the power of youth, the power of students is quite crucial to achieve a level of awareness, to do advocacy regarding the SDGs. And we cannot underestimate that. But I will refer to that later on. But in principle, we say that most people, when they think about the SDGs, they go directly to the list of SDGs and the various targets and the indicators related to each one of those goals. However, we must remember that when the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted, before the actual listing of SDGs, there's a series of paragraphs outlining and serving as a sort of a preamble to the actual SDGs, and academia as such is mentioned quite a few times, and academia is considered as a valuable stakeholder. And we have to ask ourselves, what is the meaning of that? What does it mean for academia? Academia understood as universities and colleges. What's the actual meaning of that? What does it entail to be a valuable stakeholder? It means, in the opinion of myself and in the opinion of the UN Academic Impact, and probably the opinion of the United Nations as a whole, that universities are not passive actors. Universities should and must be at the forefront of solutions, science-based solutions. So the narrowing the gap between policy, decision-making, and research is actually critical. So universities should and must play a role when it comes to the design of policies, the design of guidelines, and the actual implementation of such guidelines and policies. So universities are not there just as mere theoretical providers, but actually we need the expertise and the knowledge of universities, because one, universities have that knowledge already. Second, because universities connect quite well with the community around them. Third, because universities have a very wide range of partnerships, including with governmental and non-governmental organizations at the local, subnational, national, regional, and even in global or international levels. But also because this is a common endeavor. The United Nations, as enshrined in the United Nations Charter itself, which is our founding document, in Article 1.4, it says that the United Nations' main purpose is to be a center for harmonizing the actions to actually achieve the goals and the ideals and the purposes of the United Nations. So the United Nations wants to harmonize, wants to harness, wants to collect this common action. So we have to bring together not only member states, but also the private sector, but also the civil society, but also the churches and religious and faith-based groups, but also educational institutions and more likely institutions of higher education. So I believe this is quite relevant. So when we come to actually analyze the different sustainable development goals, of course, the one that relates the most with universities is, of course, SDG 4, which is quality education. And certainly there is a concrete mention of tertiary or higher education in there. But I would like to stress that when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goal 4, we have to think more than the traditional sense or notion of education. What is education? Education cannot be just to provide a system of teaching, learning. So the teacher, professor sends a message which is received by the given student or student body, and that's about it. Education for us has a social responsibility. So education must have a purpose in addition to the professional and individual growth of the person who is being educated at any of all the education levels, including and up to higher education. Actually, if we go deeper into what are the targets of Sustainable Development Goal 4, it clearly says that in addition to promoting access, and I was actually talking about this last evening, yesterday in another conference, about how wonderful things universities are doing to promote access to higher education, to ensure that minorities, to ensure that indigenous peoples, to ensure that migrants, even refugees, have these opportunities to start in a university, in a college, the career of their choice. But also, in addition to access, we have to make sure that education is also capable of promoting sustainable development. And this is key. This is like, I remember when I used to teach international human rights law, and those familiar with that field of expertise, we should know that member states actually is state parties to a number of international covenants and agreements and treaties on human rights. They have a mandate, and they have a responsibility to promote human rights, to investigate when there is a plausible case of vulnerability or violation of human rights, and they need to conduct and pursue such investigation, and to apply sanctions as needed, and to make reparations as requested by law. And they have to prevent human rights violation, they have to legislate in favor of human rights, and so on and so forth. But I used to say to my students at the university, but also when I was providing training to human rights and civil society organizations, I used to say that the most important responsibility of the state should be to educate the population about their human rights, because of a single reasoning. It cannot be simpler than that. Because if you don't know your rights, you are completely incapable to defend such rights. So there is actually a need for the state to promote human rights, to make people know what can they do when they feel or they know for a fact that their human rights have been violated. Now, if we take that example and we take that from the human rights field to the broader sustainable development field, why is it important for education to actually promote the SDGs and sustainable development in general? Because that is the way in which future and present generations can know for sure what can they do and what can they do better to make a more sustainable world a reality. So we are not talking about utopia, and we are not making a theory about it. So we are actually shaping the mindsets of the younger generations, because they at the in the very close future, not the distant future, we're not talking about 30, 40 or 50 years ahead from now. We're talking about right now and the next 5, 10 years. So these younger generations, those who are starting right now in many different universities and colleges around the world, those who are about to graduate, those who are already in graduate programs or in doctoral programs, these are the leaders of the world in the next 5 to 10 years. These are the people that we should educate about how sustainable development can and should be, and what can they do to make plausible all the ideas behind the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which I must remind the audience, this agenda is an agenda of minimum standards. So this is the very least that we have to accomplish by 2030 in order to have a more sustainable world. So I believe that the key element in SDG 4 is precisely the call for education to be education for sustainable development. We have to educate, we have to transform how we see education, because when we talk about sustainable development, I always say in the mindsets of most people, when we use the term sustainable, most people think in a jungle, in a forest. So it has a very strong ecological, environmental component. I am not saying that's not entirely true, but of course we know by now, for example, because of the SDGs themselves, that when we talk about sustainable development, we also include development understood from a very wide, broader perspective. When we talk about sustainability, we're talking about human rights. We are talking about governance. We're talking about poverty. We're talking about gender equality. We're talking about hunger and malnutrition. So there are quite a few areas, sectors, fields that we must include when we think about sustainable development. And this is the core issue that pertains to the social responsibility of universities. We always speak about corporate social responsibility, because we assume, and we assume well, that the private sector companies, multinational companies, they do need to embrace issues of sustainable development. But that is also true when it comes to universities and colleges. So there's no deviation between theory and practice. So if universities are actually teaching and preaching about sustainable development, this has to be transformed into the curricula, in the way we teach, in how we educate, in the things that we research about. So this is a call for universities. Is the research conducted by universities really aligned with sustainable development? What is the social purpose of research? What are we doing for our students? And the partnerships that we have, either with other universities, either with the community or civil society organizations or the local government or any other stakeholder, what is the actual purpose behind it? So we really need to come to the conclusion that if the university is not fully aligned with the sustainable development goals, then we need to actually make that possible. And the United Nations has a number of resources and a number of means to help to guide universities in that respect. A second point I would like to stress is that when we also take a look to Sustainable Development Goal 4, there's an actual call for education for global citizenship, which is also, I must add, another of the fundamental principles of the United Nations Academic Impact, where I work. We are bound not only by the principles of the UN Charter, but also we have a set of principles of our own based on those of the United Nations Charter. And one of them is promotion of sustainability through higher education. And one of the others is to promote the concept of global citizenship through higher education. Now, when we say global citizenship, that's a very rare term that most people are not very familiar with. The concept of citizenship per se perhaps ties or relates to having an ID, a nationality, to have a set of cultures, a language, a religion, identity. So when we think about global citizenship, what is the actual meaning of that? I always like to say that global citizenship is not a denial, it's not a rejection, it's not a opposition to whatever identity, nationality, or citizenship you have. The acceptance of the emergence of the concept of global citizenship and the fact that you identify yourself as a global citizen, in addition to being, for example, a Brazilian national, is not a rejection of your own culture or your own identity. It's actually an acknowledgement that you are not alone in the world, that as a global citizen, you are part of the human race, which is the only race that we have, that you are part of a global interconnected world, that you are part of the international community. And COVID-19 is a sad yet perfect example of that. COVID-19 is a global problem that demands global solutions. And this is the idea behind multilateralism. This is the idea behind the sole existence of entities and organizations such as the United Nations. So when we think about, for example, COVID-19, it's not an isolated problem. This is a global problem, and all nations from various angles and perspectives have been affected by it. So the way we are going to overcome this crisis, this global crisis, is precisely through global cooperation. And we have to acknowledge the fact that if there is a natural disaster that is caused by climate change, this is also a global problem. Human rights violations are also a global problem. When you have gross human rights violations in a country, and that produces a mass exodus of persons, refugees, asylum seekers, and so on, this is also a global problem. So the idea of being a global citizen is, yes, I am a national of XY country and I have my own culture and I have my own identity, but I also recognize and I also acknowledge the fact that I understand the problems that are in different parts of the world, I understand that such problems can actually have an impact in my very own country, in my very own vicinity. I also acknowledge the fact that there is just one human race. And the idea of fostering global citizenship through education is also critical and is applicable to pretty much every single field of study. The fact that we are actually convening this event, although virtually, and I am here in New York, most of you are in Brazil, I presume. So this is an example of what global citizenship means. Global citizenship is actually, I would say, boosted because of the emergence of information and communication technologies, and of course, these modern appliances and devices allow us to really connect more than, say, 20, 50, 100 years ago. So we really need to understand, and when you see the emblem of the United Nations that I believe is behind me in my background, that this is the world come together, and I have been privileged enough to work for the United Nations in a number of capacities and in different entities around the world. And it's absolutely wonderful when you connect with people from other countries. This is one of the fundamental values that we really appreciate. And we really, we really have a commitment towards too. So when we speak about education for global citizenship, that connects with also, which is again in the SDG 4, education must serve a purpose, must help to promote human rights, to promote cultural diversity. That's also in the SDG 4. We understand that our countries are culturally mixed, that we have, and this is an example of Latin America, not only Brazil, but also my very own country and other countries in the region. We have a heritage from Africa. We have a heritage from indigenous people. We have a heritage from Europe. And we have to really appreciate and value that cultural diversity, in addition to whatever patterns and identities are being brought by migrants and refugees. So I believe that we cannot think that countries are homogeneous societies. I think the time to advocate for that passed a long time ago. We have to really acknowledge the fact that countries, nations are culturally diverse, and this is something that, again, education has a moral responsibility to advocate for understanding, to advocate for tolerance, to advocate for integration. And actually, now that I say tolerance, although this is a term that is widely used in the United Nations, personally speaking, I don't like that much the term tolerance, because that really is really not what we want it to be. Tolerance means that basically I just stand, I have to accept the fact that somebody else is there and is different from me, has different thoughts, different ideals, the different mindset, and I just have to deal with it. But that in itself is not enough. What we really need, in addition to tolerance, is understanding. And again, the concept of global citizenship is fundamental in this regard. And I believe that when we speak about all peoples of the world coming together, we have to realize that actually the preamble of the United Nations Charter make a very concrete reference to that on the very first line. It said, "We the peoples of the United Nations." So when the United Nations was created, it didn't say we the governments, or we the presidents, or we the prime ministers, or we anything. It clearly said we the peoples of the United Nations. So again, the role of education, particularly in these complex scenarios around the world, when we have, of course, a health crisis, we have a sanitary complicated situation, but we must not forget, let us not forget, that before the pandemic, there were already a wide range of challenges around the world. So poverty did not disappear because of COVID-19. It actually grew because of COVID-19. Hunger did not disappear because of COVID-19. Actually, more people is starving around the world because of the socioeconomic consequences of COVID-19. Actually, armed conflict, instability, corruption, and human rights violations did not disappear. Violence against women did not disappear. Actually, quite the opposite, as per reports from UN Women, one of the organizations and entities of the UN dealing with women's rights and advocating for empowerment of women. So we have to really think where we are right now and where are we going to. The future is going to be to the extent of what we do now. The future is not now, but we are getting to the future with our present actions. And in that sense, how we think the world in terms of inclusiveness, how we think about the world in terms of accepting all as equals. This is not only enshrined in the Sustainable Development Goal 4 as outlined in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Actually, if we read through the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, including, for example, SDG 10, which is on reducing inequalities, precisely universities are there to counter prejudice, to fight against discrimination, to struggle against xenophobia. So universities are there to remind people, and by people I mean not only those in the university, either teaching, working, or studying at the university. The university has to be open to everybody. So the expertise and knowledge I referred to previously, that is taken outside, off campus, and beyond. And again, I said I was going to speak about the role of youth. And we at the United Nations Academic Impact, we have seen so many wonderful ideas and the passion that students have to promote ideals such as those connected with Sustainable Development Goals. This is fantastic. And this is something that universities have actually acknowledged and realized about them. They're actually helping student groups, clubs, and organizations to help them in getting the message done, in getting actual action, concrete, tangible action with concrete and tangible results. I would like to conclude again by thanking the university for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have regarding my presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Omar. You have presented us a very challenging and interesting paper or conference, and it touches many important things and many aspects that really concern my own research. So I'm really glad to have you here and to have heard your considerations. So we have one question from the audience, and also I will present this question, and then I would like to pose some questions of my own. So Hernandez, he asks you how education can help tackle the rise of xenophobia, which is a problem that challenges the idea of global citizenship. How can we go beyond the activity of teaching itself? So this is the question he poses.
Assuming that the teaching is well-oriented enough to combat xenophobia and prejudice against certain individuals or groups of individuals, vulnerable groups, etc., I believe there are many choices to be made. First, we have to really think about the research that is being conducted on that, because the research is going to provide us with actual numbers, facts, figures that we need to consider in order to actually design policies aimed at with the objective of actually countering this situation. So based on the result of research including surveys, sociological analysis, anthropological analysis, and so on, this is critical in order to, based on those results, to think of what we can do. Third, I believe the students have a meaningful role, and the design of, for example, campaigns, and we are not thinking about campaigns in the old-fashioned way. Now, with the emergence again of ICTs and the role of social media campaigns really have an impact. And if you design campaigns awareness campaigns, for example, to counter xenophobia using the right messages, the right colors, the right images, and you make them, for example, personal. It's not the same that a person in a privileged position tells you about xenophobia. You have to show the other face, a person who has suffered xenophobia or potentially can suffer xenophobia or is afraid of suffering xenophobia. So you have a clip, 5 seconds of that person, 10 seconds, that person explaining, this is my situation, this is my story. So people can actually relate with that story. People can actually relate with his or her thoughts. And I believe this is fundamental. So those are the top of my head. Research and social media advocacy could be potential solutions to that.
Thank you so much, Omar. There's another question from Jefferson. He asks, COVID has shown that the idea of globality in terms of citizenship is under scrutiny. How to overcome the abyssal differences in terms of knowledge production and knowledge legitimation in the North-South dynamic?
That's a very pertinent question, actually. We are the UN Academic Impact. We have fostering global academic cooperation. And I was talking yesterday, actually, in a meeting with the University of Oxford about precisely that topic. Of course, if we see the literature, most books are written in English. Most academic conferences are happening in the northern part of the world, in either North America and Europe. But we have plenty of examples of members of our own. For example, just at the top of my head, the University of Bergen in Norway that deals has a very wide expertise on research related to oceans and the seas. They have quite a partnership for research purposes with the University of the South Pacific in Fiji and with the universities in the southern tip of Africa, precisely because we have the understanding that this scientific collaboration is actually not only pertinent and relevant, but is key to actually solve the issues being researched. So I believe that we need the support of multilateral organizations, but we also need the willingness of universities to actually engage in such a way that this north-south divide or gap is not there when it comes to education, higher education in particular. Of course, universities have a very various differences in terms of human resources, technological resources, and more importantly, perhaps for research purposes, financial resources. But I believe there are a number of ways to overcome that, and we are glad to say that we have been seen in the past few years, and including during the ongoing pandemic, very concrete examples of how these partnerships, these collaborations can actually take place. And again, although we are in a crisis, COVID-19 pandemic has proved that digital collaboration is actually possible. So you don't need to actually travel somewhere to do research or to meet with colleagues and counterparts in the university, that you can actually do that virtually. So I believe this is a lesson learned and a best practice that might and is being shaped as we speak.
Thank you so much. Well, it's really interesting. It's unfortunate that we had to go through the pandemic to understand all that we are all interconnected, that we can share experiences, that we can interchange, and we can talk to people beyond the presidency, beyond the level of present to present people dialoguing. So it's interesting. This is one thing that we have to learn from the pandemic experience, which is a daily experience for everyone. So I just would like to ask you some general questions. I might be wrong, so it's a way for me to adapt and adjust my own conceptions and preconceptions on the subject. It seems, first of all, I would like to ask if you see differences in the ways that Latin American universities commit to the SDGs. If you see differences in the way that different knowledge areas commit to the SDGs, if you could compare Latin America and then perhaps Europe, I don't know, or only Latin American universities. And I also have the impression that the younger generations, they are becoming conscious of interconnectedness, of the need to foster human rights, of the need to foster inclusion, to fight against xenophobia, against discrimination, against Black racism, against discrimination against the LGBTQ community, etc. But it seems to me that they are learning that outside the university. You mentioned the social media, and it seems that social media are really a powerful tool, and many things have been disseminated through social media beyond hate culture. So if that is true, it seems that universities should start learning more from social media and trying to fill in the gap that it seems that actually exists between what happens in the daily lives of the younger generations and what happens at the universities. And that relates specifically to the humanities and education knowledge area. And it seems to me, I might be wrong, it seems to me that at least in Brazil, the humanities and education area, they're far beyond STEAM, biomedical, biotechnological, and other areas of knowledge. What's your opinion on that? I hope to be wrong.
Let me start with the second question. You know, when I relate to my all previous years as an educator, I always say to my students, you know, international law is the core basis of international society. Hence, the evolution of international law is very restricted and limited in nature. So in certain occasions, international relations are on the fast track, and international law is a little bit behind. So it takes time for international law to actually match the development of international relations, geopolitics, and so on. This is also the case, I believe, when it comes to being aware of sustainable development, because universities, and again, I speak out of my own experience, you know, there's certain resistance in universities. Universities, I'm not generalizing here, but some universities are very traditional in the way they teach, in what they teach, and how they teach. So it takes time to counter that tradition / resistance. But I believe that there are, again, very good examples of how universities can actually have evolved and have adapted to current and ongoing circumstances and challenges. And I do share your thoughts that perhaps social media is actually filling gaps that are there. So universities can only jump to the boat and not off the boat. So the university have actually, if I may say so, retake the responsibility and be the light that guides students. Of course, social media is very important. It's very important for us in not only the UN academic impact, but the outreach division. And we have been, for example, promoting this verified campaign to counter misinformation and disinformation related to COVID-19, for example, and climate change denial, for instance. So social media is a wonderful thing. It's a perfect means to communicate, to relate to each other. But we have to be really careful, because we have seen, particularly these 2 last years, that the use of social media can be very dangerous as well. So again, the expertise and knowledge of universities cannot be diminished, cannot be reduced, and cannot be underestimated. What we really need to do is to connect and relate that knowledge and expertise with the actual reality. So sometimes I feel that in certain cases, universities are a little bit, if I may use this word, divorced from the reality outside of campus. So I think, and this is why I emphasize so much the fact that universities need to open themselves to societies, because the potential cannot be wasted. The potential that lies in universities cannot be just put aside. That I believe the core of the, and again, COVID-19 is a perfect example. Where were the vaccines mostly developed? University research centers and labs. Where the tests, the PCR tests and the antigen tests, where were they developed? In laboratories in cooperation with those of universities. So again, universities are the solution for many, if not all, of world global problems. So I believe that this is pretty obvious to me, and I believe it's pretty obvious for most people. But the idea is that universities need to themselves rethink about their own role and how they want the world society to see them. That's my reply to your second question. Now, in terms of the how different approaches are seen when it comes to different universities and areas of expertise, of course, when we think about sustainable development goals, and because we are talking about many different fields and areas of expertise and knowledge, it is true that in some cases we have seen, I would say, the actual applicability of knowledge in certain areas is perhaps more evident and more obvious. For example, when it comes to protection of the environment and development new technologies and creating entrepreneurship. So in certain areas, it's pretty much visible, it's pretty much there. But when it comes to humanities and social sciences, perhaps the work is not readily available to be seen, but the work is being done. Again, this is my very own perception. But because of the type of sciences and areas that we are talking about, of course, the nature of the outcome of the changes, it's very different from engineering, technology, or basic sciences. So I believe that I have seen a trend in the past few years. I have seen, and it's not a fashion trend, it's an actual change of behavioral attitudes in universities and their professors and lecturers and their staff and authorities. I have seen a trend that universities are slowly but surely acknowledging the fact that they have a role to play and they have all their resources at hand, and they are doing their best to and this is again our mandate, to align themselves with the United Nations principles and the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly since they were adopted back in 2015.
Great, thank you so much. I couldn't agree more. I think you really gave us a very interesting perspective on the questions. If we have time, I would have only two more questions. So both questions are also from Jefferson, and he asks, maybe a common curricula could be developed in partnership about the global issues. Is traditional teaching falling behind in terms of contemporary issues due to the velocity in which things are happening? And he also asks how the UN sees the evolution of formal education in the next 30 years.
Let me start with the second question. We of course advocate for education at all levels, and we of course in the UN Academic Impact we have our particular focus is on higher education. Precisely, of course, we advocate to increase access and to increase the meaningful relevance of institutions of higher education. Having said that, in today's world, based on challenges, education has to be broadly understood. For example, vocational training and lifelong learning are critical aspects of education. So you don't necessarily need to have a degree in order to have an education. There are many different ways of education, and SDG 4 actually clearly states that. And for example, to promote youth entrepreneurship, vocational training is actually key in developing countries because you need people to have the skills right now, no 5 or 6 years from now, but right now, in order to have hands-on experience, in order to reduce unemployment rates, in order to actually find the skilled labor force that you really need to fulfill all the requirements of industry, the government, and so on. So I believe, of course, again, we advocate for a higher education, but we cannot diminish the fact that non-formal education is also education. And we cannot deny the fact that millions of people around the world are actually enrolled in non-formal programs of education. Some of them, by the way, are actually taught in universities by university professors. So many universities around the world, many UNAI, UN Academic Impact member institutions are actually quite active in the promotion of these non-traditional forms of education, not to mention, for example, the fact that the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People called, for example, for indigenous people have the right to have their own educational systems, which we can or cannot consider as formal education, but they are education systems nonetheless. So the United Nations is actually the idea of education as a whole cannot be bound by very tight, formats. We need to be flexible in that sense, because the idea is not only to increase literacy, which is in itself a very possible goal, but also to be able to each individual develop itself and within the society, the community, within the interests of that they have and those of the society they belong to. In respect to the first question, UNESCO, our partnered entity headquartered in Paris that deals with education, science, and culture, and some UNAI members, they have developed curricula models, if I may use that word. And I believe this is something that can be shared. There are many ongoing collaboration efforts to, it might be a very challenging endeavor to create a single set of curricula that is applicable universally and around the world. But certainly there are many universities that are trying to include sustainable development issues in their curricula, regardless of the field of expertise. There are many universities that are exchanging between them models on how to transversalize the SDGs in the curricula of the different schools and faculties. So this is being done as we speak, and I'm more than happy to share with the university and others experiences and best practices that are being currently undertaken by other universities around the world.
Thank you so much, Omar Hernández. It has been a pleasure hearing to your considerations and all your expertise. We have all learned a lot, and we hope we keep in touch. So it was very, very interesting to have you here. Thank you so much. And I just would like to warn people who are here that we're going to have at 10:30 a panel with Dr. Poonam Singh Nigan from Ulster University, and she will be dealing also with topics related to SDG 4. And the title of her presentation is Transnational Education Achievements and Prospects, Role of International Tertiary Education. So thank you so much, and we see you all in a moment.